Did you know? Donkey Kong wasn't even supposed to be in DK King of Swing, or that WarioWare is basically a sequel to 1 minute of a 64DD game, or how Fire Emblem fangirls used to mail hunky characters chocolates addressed to the devs. As usual, we went trawling through Japanese magazines looking for fun stories, rare trivia, and behind-the-scenes tidbits to translate for this video. So let's get into it. In America, Metroid Fusion's remembered for launching the same day as Metroid Prime, but in Japan, it came out a few months later on the same day as the Game Boy Advance SP. Sorta like how Metroid Dread released alongside the Switch OLED. Basically, as mid-generation refresh launch titles. Fusion's kinda considered the black sheep of 2D Metroid, and in a few interviews we had translated, director Yoshio Sakamoto elaborates why it was made that way. He says it had been 9 years since the last entry, so he expected old fans would be rusty, and if he hadn't taken it easy on them, he would have felt like a stubborn old man clinging to the past. Those middle schoolers that devoted countless hours to Super Metroid are adults now, and don't have the perseverance or endless free time they had a decade ago. Quote, "People told me, you can't do what you did 9 years ago. And I realized, oh yeah, guess everyone's grown up." One way he made it easier was dividing the game into small sectors and giving Samus constant directions and waypoints. In the past, providing explicit guidance, or even having text at all, was, quote, forbidden. This time, Fusion's got lots of text, which Sakamoto says he wrote all himself. Every word. He also made Fusion easier by, well, adding an easy mode. None of the previous entries had difficulty settings, but for Fusion, they implemented easy, normal, and hard. Only in Japan, though, where the game came out later and had a little more time in the oven. In the West, we didn't get those options. Sakamoto acknowledges that so much text, hand-holding, and easier difficulty sorta takes away from the essence of Metroid, but hoped that it would make things smoother not only for aging fans, but newcomers as well. Because despite being one of Nintendo's legacy franchises, as old as Zelda, it had never been a big seller. "I think before," he said, "Metroid was a series that pushed people away. It was just too hard and easy to get lost. The changes seem to have worked though, as Fusion ultimately sold even better than its predecessor, Super Metroid." A couple years later, they made Metroid Zero Mission and said in another interview it was a return to form that's harder, with less handholding, and practically zero text. But ultimately, it only sold half as much as Fusion. After that, we didn't get another 2D Metroid for over a decade. Unfortunately, it seems the authentic Metroid experience really does have limited appeal. We say that as huge Metroid fans, by the way, with nothing but love. Or maybe we're misinterpreting the reasons for Zero Mission's low sales, seeing as the designers themselves said it was compromised in development. Murasawa Takayashi remarked, "I wish we'd made something richer." And Nakata Ryuichi explained, "We had a lot of things we wanted to add at first, but there were a lot of things we couldn't do to make it all happen. So we laid the groundwork as quickly as we could, and I think we achieved about half the things we wanted to include." He goes on to say, that's just how development goes sometimes, and despite all that, turned out to be a good game. It definitely was, though it is shorter than Super and Fusion. They also talk about the game's earlier aesthetic, with Chibi Samus looking like she did in the NES original. "We actually had a different art style at first," says Murasawa. "We made it look faithful to the original Metroid 1. We made it kind of cute with everything in that same style, but Nintendo of America told us to stop." Nakata adds, "NOA said Metroid needs to look realistic. It's a title that mostly sells overseas, so NOA's opinion was important. If Metroid was popular in Japan though, this is probably how it would have looked at release." We've got more GBA facts coming up, but first, a word from this video's sponsor, ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN is a virtual private network service designed to keep your online activity private and secure while letting you bypass online censorship. Depending on where you live, your internet service provider can see and log everything you do online and sell that data to advertisers. In the UK and Australia, ISPs must log every website you visit, app you use, and every private conversation for up to 2 years. And whoever owns the router you're connected to can see your browsing history, even when using incognito mode. But ExpressVPN encrypts and reroutes 100% of your activity, so you can browse safely with an encrypted connection that masks your IP address. You can even connect to servers in other countries and access region-locked content. We've used this feature ourselves to view geo-blocked content when researching games, and it works great. You can even use it to access streaming services or watch shows and movies that aren't available in your region. ExpressVPN invests only in premium servers, making it consistently faster than competitors. And with new tiered plans, you can get it for its lowest price ever, just $3.49 a month, or about 12 cents a day. Find out how you can get up to 4 extra months by scanning the QR code on screen, clicking the link in the description box below, or by going to expressvpn.com/DYKG. And now, back to the trivia. DK King of Swing was a game few played, but for the time, it had an interesting gimmick. The L button controls DK's left hand and R controls his right. When the team started development, that was the entire concept. We translated an interview from Nintendo Online Magazine's June 2005 issue, where it's revealed the game wasn't even supposed to include Donkey Kong at all. And the developers at Payon, an outside studio by the way, had never even made a Donkey Kong game before. We started with an original character, remembers producer Toshiharu Izuno. But I wanted it to be something that would sell well around the world. We thought if it was Donkey Kong, it might work. So we changed the character. We gave a presentation to Miyamoto, and he gave us the green light to commence full development. He goes on to say that for a while, they were making it for the GameCube that switched to handheld halfway through. Unfortunately, when it finally hit the GBA, it ended up one of the worst-selling games in the series. It reviewed decently though, with 7 out of 10s, so Nintendo let them make a sequel anyway, DK Jungle Climber for DS, which reviewed a little higher and sold a little better, but still not great, to be honest. Payon simultaneously developed Donkey Kong Barrel Blast for Wii, which turned out as the worst reviewed DK game of all time by far. Looking at these dates, you can see how much of a rough patch the mid-2000s was for the Big Ape. After that, Nintendo didn't let Payon make any more Donkey Kong games. In a 2003 issue of Nintendo Dream Magazine, WarioWare's director Matsuoko Hirofumi says the game, and by extension, the entire WarioWare series, is sort of a sequel to a 64DD game that only sold a few thousand copies. More specifically, to a mode in Mario Artist Polygon Studio called Sound Bomber, which was made up of a mere 8 microgames you could play through in literally 1 minute. It's some of the most obscure, least played content Nintendo's ever produced. Hirofumi was Polygon Studios' director, and after making Wario Land 4, wanted to make a continuation of Sound Bomber, this time with over 200 microgames. A lot of them are homages to old Nintendo products, with Hirofumi saying he went exploring around the office for stuff to make microgames out of. He ended up finding a lot of the late Gunpei Yokoi's inventions, the guy who had been Miyamoto's mentor and arguably made Nintendo what it is today. He made games out of Yokoi's 1970s light guns, the Ultra Machine, Rob the Robot, Dr. Mario, Duck Hunt, Wild Gunman, Virtual Boy, and countless more. As a result, a lot of WarioWare plays like an interactive Gunpei Yokoi museum. Hirofumi also talks about how WarioWare was the only game released the same day as the Game Boy Player, which let you play GBA on your TV. Hirofumi actively encourages readers to play WarioWare on the big screen with friends, or solo on the go. It's admittedly kind of a reach, but an argument could be made it was Nintendo's very first hybrid game. 14 years before the Switch. Sure, the Super Game Boy launched for Super Nintendo with Tetris 2 and Donkey Kong years before, but WarioWare was designed as a hybrid experience in a way those games simply weren't. Likewise, the GBA's connectivity with GameCube made for sort of a proto-Wii U experience, which itself was simplified to design the Switch. Nintendo's often praised for hardware innovation and unique ideas, including by us, though it's interesting to think how a lot of their seemingly out-of-left-field creations are really more refinements of ideas they had decades ago than they are brand new concepts. In another interview in issue 90 of Nintendo Dream, Castlevania series producer Koji Igarashi shows off his business card, which he likes to present upside down to create an inverted cross, a symbol of the devil. He says his wife designed it for him. Talking about Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, he explains why it's set in the future despite all previous entries taking place in the past. Basically, because they had no choice. He says, quote, "Castlevania is a series with a lot of constraints in terms of story because Dracula resurrects once every 100 years, and even a timeline was released. We created it ourselves, after all. As you can see, there's no room left to insert any more stories where Dracula's revived. That's why we decided to make him appear in the future." The game begins with the protagonists getting sucked into a solar eclipse in Japan in the year 2035. Igarashi chose 2035 because there'll be a solar eclipse there in real life, in Japan, around 10 AM on September 2nd, to be exact. Unfortunately for us Western fans, it won't be visible on our side of the world. Besides its futuristic setting, another aspect that made Aria stand out was its soul system, which let you kill over 100 enemy types and gain their powers. Iga says the system was originally supposed to let you transform into all those monsters, but got downgraded to dominating them instead, because a GBA cartridge couldn't hold all the data for so many transformations, and making them all would have been a lot of work. Even with the reduced scope, Iga says the main programmer was miserable anyway. Speaking of that programmer, Iga shares some obscure behind the scenes, like why the skeleton waiter carries a bowl of curry, because in real life, the programmer eats nothing but curry. He also hates sushi, which is why despite being a healing item in previous games, there's not a single sushi to be found in Aria of Sorrow. Iga kept pestering him to add some into the game, but the programmer simply said no. If you haven't played Aria of Sorrow, by the way, you probably should. It's the best of the trilogy, and one of the highest reviewed games in the system's library. As a side note, Iga also mentions that after Symphony of the Night on PlayStation, they considered a direct sequel on PlayStation 2. But that, quote, "developing a 2D game on PS2 was more challenging than anticipated. But on GBA, 2D's the norm, and it can achieve graphics roughly equivalent to Super Famicom. As good as the Castlevania games were on GBA, it sure would have been cool to see how the game that put the Vania in Metroidvania could have evolved on home console." Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade was the series' 7th entry, but the first to come to the West, where it was simply called Fire Emblem. By then, Smash Bros. Melee had already been out a couple years, and introduced the masses to Marth and Roy. According to Fire Emblem's producer, Toru Narihiro, Melee not only brought in a new audience of foreigners, but also Japanese children. In Nintendo Dream's 89th issue, they say Fire Emblem's possibly the Nintendo series with the oldest age demographic, averaging in their mid to late 20s, but now they had a bunch of elementary schoolers showing up too. Additionally, Sakurai was, quote, "blunt with harsh criticism, saying the previous Fire Emblem was too difficult for modern audiences. Taking his criticisms to heart, and considering the influx of kids and foreigners, they decided to make Blazing Blade into something of a soft reboot, with lower difficulty, in hopes they could restore Fire Emblem to its former glory as one of Nintendo's flagship franchises. But they also added a trickier hard mode, to make it up to longtime fans who might be upset their adult series was getting watered down for the sake of the noobs. In addition to having an older audience than other series, Fire Emblem also had a large female player base, thanks in part to romance systems that let players woo each other and sometimes have kids together. So much so that Blazing Blade's director says girls used to send chocolates to their studio addressed to characters like Marth as a show of romantic affection. Another thing that made Blazing Blade different was that in older games, the player was the protagonists, but this time you play the part of an unseen military strategist who directs the protagonists. Initially, it was only supposed to work that way in the early game during Lynn's story to teach new players the ropes. After that, you take direct control of Eliwood for the second story. Nintendo higher-ups liked the strategist angle though, so they told the devs to make the entire game that way, and Blazing Blade had to get delayed several months to implement the change. Before launch, Nintendo supervisor Hitoshi Yamagami said outright that after Blazing Blade, they wanted to make a sequel on GameCube, but wouldn't be able to if Blazing Blade didn't sell enough. He was very explicit and practically begged people to buy it. Unfortunately, it undersold in Japan, but luckily sold a lot more overseas, thanks in part to Melee, so they were able to make the jump to GameCube with Path of Radiance in 2005. Did you also know Metroid Prime's entire game world was made brighter in the Japanese version because Nintendo's office was better lit than Retro Studios? For 20 minutes of GameCube trivia plucked from Japanese magazines, click the video on screen. Or if you'd rather binge a couple more hours of GBA facts, click the other video. Special thanks to our translator Jacob and proofreaders Mike D, Modern Hog, and Joshua Nantenjex Goldie. And of course, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.